now the next section is where we come closer to home, and we take your listen to your thoughts on how counter religions that arose in India or in the Hindu civilizational continuum, like the Nastika Mathas, were managed. And then once we talk about the organic counter religions, there are, we'll also talk about a little bit about the disguised mutants or lab-grown hybrids like Dravidianism and Puragami Neo-Buddhist counter-religious strains. So probably if you could just walk us through, and at the same time, if you could also tell us about how the Indian, native Hindu scientific tradition, in a sense, it seemed to have been helped by the counter religions, but from when did it start, diminishing? From when was it the Islamic invasions specifically that created the diminishing of the Hindu scientific tradition, or was it something else? So I just like a nice this thing of it's basically
of these 2 points.
Of these 2 points.
So a counter religion always is influenced by the religion which it is countering, and we see this whether it's in West Asia or India. Akhenaten, he's making an existing deity as his sole deity and eliminating the rest. When in the Jewish tradition, the Judaism made Yahweh the sole deity. Yahweh was part of a pantheon. He was a Vayu-like deity of the earlier Western Semitic tradition. So it's usually the focality on one deity within the pantheon, which is how it arises. Now, in say the case of the Zoroastrian Iranian tradition, we see this process happening all the steps can be seen. That is the Varuna-like deity, Ahura Mazda. Even in the Rig Veda, Varuna is addressed as the Asura Medhira, which is a cognate term. So Ahura Mazda was the Varuna-like deity. He became the focal point, and the other deities, the other devas, were now demonized, and the diva became a negative term. But at the same time, he couldn't break totally from the old religion. So while he said the Nainhaitya, the cognates of the Nasatya, the Ashwins, are demons, he brought in Haurvatat and Amiratat, 2 concepts, the twin deities, where still they were brought as agents or assistants of Ahura Mazda. So from the back door, you see that some of the religion's tendency, the old religion's tendencies come back. So counter religions can be seen as a spectrum, as the spectrum being the degree to which they go, the river starts flowing in the opposite direction. But in the case of the Buddha and Mahavira, these 2 counter religions, there are some unique factors. Now, Zarathustra did not call himself a god. He only made one god of the existing pantheon as the sole god. Whereas right from the beginning, we see that in at least the Buddhist tradition, there is a focality on the human. Now, probably such focalities existed in the broader tradition. That by itself doesn't make something a counter religion. Like the worship of the Sattvatas. Unlike the white Indologists, I believe that the Sattvata tradition predates the Buddha. So I do think Krishna and Baladeva and Aniruddha, Pradyumna, they are all historical figures. But there was a superimposition of a religion onto them. That is, there were gods. The god Vasudeva was now superimposed onto Krishna Devaki Putra. And the Samkarshana, who was the emanation of the Vasudeva, was superimposed onto the historical figure. So the focality on human on human figures was not something new. There was a matrix. There was a matrix of that in the Indo-European religions which existed. But the Buddha, he was pretty distinctive in that he didn't try to superimpose any gods onto himself, but he put himself above them. And so while he may have not explicitly asked people to worship him per se, in very direct terms, he did encourage it. And by placing himself above the gods and showing the gods as coming to hear his teachings or those of former Buddhas, he paved the way for subsuming or placing the other religion, the old religion, as a layer below his. But his most subversive aspect was the redefinition of terms. So like Trividya, normally it meant to the Hindu, if we want to use that term, to the Arya of that age, it meant the three types of chants, the rigs, which were metrical chants, the yajush, which were prose chants, and the songs, the sermons. But the Buddha totally redefined it as the special Buddhist knowledge of the past and future lives and the path to nirvana and the like. Then he called his teachings and himself as Arsha. So again, he was subverting the term of a rishi. And he subverted the Upanishadic concept of the Atman as anatta. That is, he reverted it. So the counter-religious tendency here expressed itself as redefining in often opposite ways. In the case of anatta, the Atman was really reversed, and that's a big point in his counter-religious tradition. So it was the capture and redefinition of the terms which I think was the big driving force in the case of the Buddhist counter-religion. The Jaina situation is a little more complicated. Again, you can see that their main rivals were the Shrauta performing Brahmanas, and there could have been an element of the Kshatriya trying to show that their intellectual tradition is superior to that of the Brahmanas. Some element of that, I don't want to push that too much, which was also driving both these founders of the Indian counter-religions. There was a third guy, Maskarin of the Goshala, of the cowshed. But he was initially a partner of Mahavira, but he did not seem to go too far, though the Jivika tradition is supposed to have existed for some time, but we really don't have too much material from their side. And the Jaina material is very partisan. It shows them in very negative light. But in the case of the Jaina redefinition, a lot of it was focused on, again, countering the Shrauta tradition and its capacity to provide some goals. So one thing which these may have had in common with, say, the Western, the Semitic counter-religions, especially in the case of Buddhism, lesser so in the Jaina case, is some kind of utopian promise. So the way it begins, Buddha makes a very real observation. Life is full of sorrow. And I don't think anyone can deny that. And that was a true observation. And then he goes on to give an explanation for it. He says, desire is the root cause of sorrow. So in this way, it's very similar to how in the Occidental counter-religions, they understand this thing that there is sorrow in life, or they would say life is full of inequality, like say Navyonmada, the new woke religion of America. It's constructed on similar principles. You diagnose you see a real problem and you state it. And I think most people won't disagree with the problem that yes, there is life has sorrow, or maybe it has inequalities or iniquities. And then they give you a cause for it. And that's where they go off the rails, because the Buddha says desire is the root cause of all sorrow. Now, if you're in the mode of believing, which a lay person tends to be, you may say, hey, this makes sense. If I eat a lot of some oily stuff, I get some problem after that with digestion. So the desire to eat the tasty stuff resulted in a health issue for me. Okay, it seems to correlate. That's how a person who doesn't think through all the whole structure may easily come to the conclusion, okay, his diagnosis is correct of the problem. And then he offers a solution. He says to remove sorrow, to remove dukkha, you need to remove desire. The karma has to be extinguished. So then, since you have been converted by the first two steps, you accept this third thing. And that third solution usually has a utopian aspect to it, which in the case of the Buddhist teaching, and to a degree in the Jaina teaching, you may say Hindus have a proto element of it. It has some kind of utopian endpoint. So that's what I would term the hook. And once these come about, if they existed by themselves within the larger framework without contravening it, I think they would have digested themselves. Like say the Mundakopanishad, it makes certain statements which a true Vaidika won't like. It calls the Samhitas as lower knowledge, and the knowledge of Atman as a higher knowledge. And this is not too different from the Bauddha viewpoint. He'll also tell you that the Samhita knowledge, or the whole Vaidika corpus, is a lower knowledge, and this Nirvana which he's teaching is the higher knowledge. But the Mundakopanishad is totally accepted and internalized because it didn't go against in a very drastic way. It still accepts Samskrita, Shruti, and all as things which you have to practice. Whereas he explicitly, when two Brahmanas from the Bharadwaja, I think, and Bhargava Gotras approached him and said, we can set your stuff in Chandas. He said, no, I want it to be in the vulgar Pali. So there you see this language distinction. And that's again, when you have a marker which sets you aside from the mainstream, that's a very important factor in the emergence of counter-religion. So like say in the Sikh traditions, the emergence of the counter aspect, they were, for a long time, nobody really saw them as non-Hindus. But once you start acquiring some markers which distinguish you from the rest of the population, and you're very insistent on those markers, then so that is running contrary to the flow or the mainstream. Then you start branching off as a counter-religion. Now, I would say that the Buddhist and the Jaina tradition, the way it evolved was, there was this branching away, the non-acceptance of Samskrita being the big point, apart from the non-acceptance of the Shruti. So the non-Samskritic traditions in the Pali and the Ardhamagadi, which started off, resulted in that schism, and eventually there was a fall back because the Samskrita cosmopolis could not be escaped. It was only growing, the horizon was only growing larger. The number of people using and Samskrita and presenting intellectual material in it was not shrinking but growing. And I would say that that's what sort of tethered these religions to a degree back to the parent. So in the case of the Buddhist world, Ashwagosha wrote his famous works in Samskrita, and in good Kavya, he was a Brahmana himself. And so there was a re-Samskritization in the Jaina tradition too, you see the re-emergence of a Samskrita tradition.
Yes,
And
and
another,
Nagarjuna in the Buddhist tradition.
absolutely. So,
And it's
and
interesting that you
even,
should mention this because the Bhakti literature, for example, the traditional hymns, the Divya Prabandham, Nalayara Divya Prabandham, or the Tevara Tiruvachagam concept, the corpus, sorry, Tevara corpus, both of
yeah,
these eventually were Sanskritized by the Ramanuja Bhashyams and the various Bhashyakaras.
yes, the Ubhaya
Or,
Vedanta
yeah,
of the Tamil Vaishnava tradition, the Ubhaya itself, the Tamil is now coming back into the Sanskritic tradition.
yes. And again, I see it in the Maharashtrian, where the language of the original corpus is in the Maharashtri, which is the local register. It is being, Sanskritized using the Bhakta Vijayam and,
Right, right.
yes. So
There
that's a
is
very
another
interesting trend.
interesting case in Maharashtra of the pastoral deities like Khandoba. So the Khandoba, the original Khandoba tales are narrated by these wandering narrators, the gurus, who sometimes they act out like they'll walk on all four and bark like a dog to illustrate the dog of Khandoba. So it's all in Marathi, but there is a Samskrita Purana where he's now called Martanda Bhairava, and it is completely Samskritized. The war with the two asuras is presented in a very Pauranika style, which is quite different from the Guruv's folk narration. So Samskritization is an important tether, and those traditions, those counter-religious impulses in India which failed to come back to the Sanskritic realm, uh, often diverge beyond a point of compatibility, we may say so. And the other important point is religion, is marriage. So in the Jaina tradition, I think that was very important. They have several records within their own writings, and we know from modern Indians that in the Vaishya communities where the Jaina Mata is popular, there is marriage with those who follow the mainstream Sanatana Dharma. So when you marry, when the marriage barrier is not there, then there is a tendency for the Sanatana Dharma to come back. And you'll have hybrid households, so the divergence never goes too far.
Yeah,
And
you
I
can
think
see
that,
it. You can see it in, you could see it till the 19th century and early 20th century among Sikh households. And you can see it today among Arya Samaj households.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So could you move on to some of the lab grown hybrids, as I call them, like Dravidianism and the neo-Buddhist tradition? I mean, I don't know whether any tradition has built around them, and especially around the Dravidianist, this thing, there is a corpus of literature and of polemics, but beyond that, there is no ritual, there is no, there is nothing much beyond the corpus of polemics on the Dravidianist side. But on the neo-Buddhist side, some kind of, ritual and things have seemed to have been created around it. Could you just touch upon these two lab-grown hybrids?
See,
Briefly?
Dravidianism, I think I'll just be short with it. It is polemical, as you say. It's just like how in 1920s and 30s Germany, while this is not a precise example, but still there is some parallel. There it's all, everything is a counter-religion there, but the Christian reaction against Judaism. So it's just a certain kind of ethnic hate which comes out when you see one group succeeding and the other not doing as well. And if there is a catalyst which can sort of tell you that that guy is really bad and he's the cause who's keeping you in this low performing state, then that's the utopianism, which is very similar to any Abrahamism, which promises that when we get rid of the infidel, when we get rid of the unbeliever. We'll usher in this great era of the coming of the Christ, or going to Jahannam, or whatever. And likewise, I think the Dravidianists and the Mahatma Phule movement in Maharashtra, I don't know if I should call him a Mahatma, but let's give him that. Mahatma is an abused term in India anyhow nowadays. There is the catalyst were the English. The Justice Party clearly had English catalysis in Tamil Nadu. So it's not that Phule was anti-Hindu to start with. He was very much part of the Peshwa superstructure, and he had fought against the English in the early days. And then the catalyst comes and gives you the very essentialized tenet of an Abrahamism. There is a utopia once you get rid of this unbeliever who's oppressing you. And I think that's all Dravidianism is. Now, in the case of Ambedkar, to give him his dues, he was a guy who read widely. He had a deep hate for Brahmanas, which is undeniable. But having read widely, though not correctly understood all what he read, I think he had some sense that going to Abrahamism is not a solution. And he wanted to stay within the Dharma fold, one may say. So he decided to go for his understanding of Buddhism, the Bauddha Mata. And there have always been understandings of the older tradition, which may not necessarily be exactly what it is. Like, I would be very blunt in saying today's Vaidikas don't fully understand what the composers of the Vedas said, but still they are very much aligned to it. And over the ages, there have been many different interpretations of the Shruti. So they all say that they are owing allegiance of, or their allegiance is with the Shruti. So Madhva, the founder of his tradition, how he looks at the Shruti is going to be is very different from the way, say, Shankara looks at it. But they are still there. They say that we owe our allegiance to the Shruti. So likewise, you can say that the Bhaimi Mata of Bhimrao, it's his interpretation of the Buddhist tradition, which is a mixture of Western conditioning, and that's where the counter-religious aspect comes, the Brahmana as the enemy, and or more generally the upper caste as the enemy, and the creation of some kind of a uniformity of the oppressed or the depressed class. But we know from ethnography, like say even in Maharashtra, the Mahang and Mahar, they are hardly the same, and they were at conflict with each other, and the conflict between them was probably much more intense than any of them had with a Brahmana or a Maratha. And it's not that they were excluded from society either. That is, even in Shivaji's army, there were these jatis were very much there as men who fought in his armies. So they were part of the mainstream, but there was a certain what we may call the jati stratification, which existed throughout India in various configurations. The stresses of Islam and the English conquest certainly aggravated the schisms which may have existed. I think the 12-fold jati system which existed in Maharashtra and some variant thereof which existed all over India was actually a very symbiotic and coherent system which survived for a very long time. It was all an issue of supplying labor. And so each of these jatis, from the village astrologer who may have been a Brahmana down to the Mar or the Mang, they all lived in the same village in a certain kind of symbiosis. And I believe this existed even in the Tamil country in a variant form, but it's not the same 12 jatis, but a similar constellation of jatis. So in order to break them away, you need to give them that impulse. And I think that impulse was entirely an external one from the English. And that came, say, in Maharashtra via Phule, the Justice Party in Tamil Nadu. Now, this was internalized by Ambedkar. He bought all of that. But due to his reading, my understanding is he didn't want to go Abrahamistic. So he decided to stay within the Dharma. And he came up with his own Bhaimi Matha, which was an interpretation of the Bauddha tradition. Now, it's up to his followers and people who follow their religion to decide what course they must take. But I think really what's important since I am a Brahmana, what's important from my perspective is that the hate is what needs to go. If you want to follow your Mata, that's fine. And you want to construct your own rituals, that's your call. So I would leave it at that.
Right. So anyways, there would have been a longer discussion on the specific situation in the 18th and the 19th century, which accentuated the socio-economic divide. And in the engaged in, if you look at the communist historians, they write in detail about how land and capital over the 19th century, especially during the colonial rule, where land and capital was accumulated very strongly in the hands of a very few jatis. And as a result, many of the, and also because of disruption in the local economic structure, a lot of the traditional occupations lost their value. So as a result, you had these small, large landholding and capitalist class, which was composed of a small clique of population and a large mass of unskilled labor, and and all the social problems and economic problems which arise from such a situation where
that's
you have
true.
huge disparities.
I don't disagree with that. That's what I try to subsume in a very simple description as the stressors of the English tyranny and the Islamic tyranny before that. And I think the English tyranny should simply be seen as a continuation, because there were certain practices like tax farming, which were introduced in the Islamic period. And tax farming meant that it would allow for it would select, it was like a selective force for the emergence of this kind of land concentrating jati, who would serve as the intermediary to the tax collector. He would farm tax in his locale and he would send it upward through the chain. And at the same time, there was also other kinds of movements which I think caused this kind of divide, where the military labor, everyone used to be armed in India in the past. So the English, wherever the English were gaining in ascendancy, the arming was decreased over time. I'm not saying it happened, especially where they gained total control. They saw it appropriate to disarm the Indians to reduce the chance of the rebellion. And as you know, after 1857, it was all over. So that is, they took over. And so that I think accentuated the divide to quite a degree, because one of the modes of upward mobility was to be in the army, to be in a mercenary. So essentially, all of Indian military history, going back to the Yavana invasion of Alexander of Macedon, can be seen as control of military labor. and entrepreneurs who deal in military labor. And so once that system was broken, I think it accentuated the degradation of certain groups. Phule could have fought in 1857 as a warrior, and it was a path for upward mobility. But once that was shut off, then you seek other avenues.
Interesting. This is an aspect that I hadn't thought of. So I should probably read further on this aspect. Any specific pointers that you would want our listeners?
There is a book by a Western author. I don't remember its precise title. Nauker and Sepoy, military labor, something like that. Going through that book will give you a lot of additional references.
Great.
I wrote an essay too on the earlier phase, that is before the English takeover, of how the pastoral castes or jatis were a big force in supplying military labor, and it was a mode of upward mobility.
Yes, we can see that in the Palaikaran system or the Polygar system in Tamil Nadu.
Absolutely.
Yeah, many of them were actually pastoral jatis, and
yes,
today you will see a complete reversal in situation where the pastoral, Golla prototype Kambalat Nayakar are actually at the lower end of the caste hierarchy, but the earlier people, the Kammas and the Reddys, who are at the lower end of the caste spectrum, are now at the top end of the caste spectrum because of their entrepreneurship in military and policing.
Absolutely. I think the Kammas and the Reddys, they were masters of military labor management. And the very fact that the so-called elite of Tamil Nadu, non-Viva, non-Brahmana elite, is primarily coming from the Andhra Kamma groups, tells the story. And the whole fight back against Islam in the South was initiated by them, like Vemareddy, Prolaya Nayaka, and the like. And they were able to fight back because they were managers of armed labor, that is military, mercenary. They were entrepreneurs in mercenary labor.
Okay, so moving on to a very different aspect, one of the interesting things that we have noticed is that we have records of counter polemics to Christian polemicists from intellectuals like Chattambi Swamigal and from Arumukha Navalar, or even Swami Dayanand Saraswati, who gave counter polemics. But these were
also Tarka Panchanana
in Bengal.
In Bengal,
and
so
Maharashtra also had
Maharashtra
also had a counter polemicist, if I'm not wrong.
It had a bunch of them. I'm not immediately recalling their names, which is sort of bad, but definitely there was extensive counter polemics in Maharashtra. Some of these took a tragic turn, but that is, some of them were railing and ranting against real science, which contradicted their scientific understanding, like the Virodhas, which were written in Maharashtra against the heliocentric hypothesis. And they wanted to reinstate the geocentric model. So that I would characterize that as wasted labor, but there was a broad polemical tradition. Yeah.
Right. But we see that only in the second half of the 19th century onwards, and this counter polemicist tradition seems to have stopped right towards the time of independence. But before that, when it's not as though the Christians and Muslims came to India only in the 19th century. There's been a long tradition of them coming and engaging in criticism of religion and polemics. Where were the counter polemicists before the 19th century? Were they even there? What was happening?
I often get this question, and I don't know if I can answer it to the satisfaction of people who want to hear that, yes, we had such a flourishing tradition, because I cannot show texts to say that, hey, here is this flourishing tradition. On the other hand, from all what I've seen, I think it was not zero. So we have to go back really far in time to the period of the Ghaznavid invasions and the earliest. So the Arab inroads into Western India were very limited. At least that's my opinion. They managed to conquer the Sindh. There was the great battle of Rajasthan where the Arab ambitions were completely sunk. But Indian thought did infiltrate into the Arab intellectual world. And that's how you see the emergence of these free thinkers in the Islamic world. And these free thinkers extensively cite the doctrines and ideas which they say come from the Barahima. Now, this Barahima is their term for the Brahmanas. And many of the statements which we see preserved in their free thinker literature, we can clearly say have a Hindu origin because they are talking of Samkhya and utilizing the Samkhya framework in their polemics. And they say that these Barahima taught these polemics against the Abrahamistic religions. And there were counter attacks on that. That is, they wrote counter polemics against these Barahima polemics brought in by the free thinkers. And you see that not just with the Muslims, but also Jews and Christians. So they were really threatened by it. And one of the things which seems to have threatened them is the Samkhya idea that there is a consciousness which exists separately and it unites with matter. And so that opens the door for two things, that non-human organisms are conscious, they have consciousness, and the possibility of reincarnation, punarjanma. So both of these are fatal for those Abrahamistic religions. And so they spent a lot of time trying to refute. So what this implies is that there was an old tradition of polemics when Islam was encountered. Now, what we hear from the Islamic adventurer scholar who came along with Mahmud Ghaznavi is Al-Biruni, is that the Hindus did not want to talk to the Muslims. He is very explicit about it. So I think the Ghaznavid invasions mark a period when the trauma of the other was so strong that it was not an issue of polemics anymore. It was a life and death struggle. And when it transitioned to this life and death struggle, it was viewed more as a disease or a locus or pestilence. You almost get that vibe. I don't remember the exact words of the shloka, but you get the vibe in, say, Vedanta Deshika's shloka, the Abhitistava, I believe, to Vishnu, where the invader is named along with other things as a cause of bhaya, which needs to be repelled. So there's this trend. I think the experience was so traumatic and it was so dramatic, in a sense like the current wave of the pandemic hitting India, where some of the analysis is just put aside. You're looking for survival. And I think that the shift to that mode happened somewhere between the Ghaznavid and the Ghurid invasions. And it lasted all the way. But is it that no polemics happened? I think we have evidence that there was a lot of polemical activity, but it was just not composed as a text. And there's the scholar from Canada called Arvind Sharma who has written a good book where he summarizes some of these things. We know that there were Hindus in Delhi during the time of Firoz Shah Tughlaq, a monstrous tyrant, and Ibrahim Lodi, who were converting Mohammedans to back to, or probably it was Garvapasi. I don't know if there were Turks who were being converted to the Hindu religion. And we hear of the same during Aurangzeb's reign. And so there were these guys who were arguing, sometimes in flawed ways, but nevertheless arguing against Islam and trying to bring back people. And two of them got immolated along with their images of the gods by the sultans in Delhi. And I think Aurangzeb demolished the schools and shut down those in his reign. But on the other hand, during the reign of Akbar, and Sarvesh Tiwari, whom you may know from Twitter, had written some essays on this, and I would ask people to look it up. And there's a lot more material on that. The Akbar held these interreligious discussions, and there is the record of Brahmanas routinely defeating the Islamic scholars, Jainas too. There's a Jaina who wrote extensive polemics. There's an Iranian, Zoroastrian, who wrote extensive counter polemics. Of course, he was arguing against the Hindus and Jainas too, in addition to Islam. But we do have the record that Akbar was swayed by these polemics, because his own biographer says that he says all kinds of bad things against the religion of Muhammad, and he's now influenced by these heretics. So all this goes to say that there was a polemical tradition, but it did not express itself or it as a vigorous textual culture. Now, the traditional acharyas in southern India, like in Sringagiri or the Vaishnava acharyas, I don't think they saw the Abrahamistic religions as something which fits within their axioms, as something to even make arguments about. Because after all, our tradition is like geometric proofs. You have some axioms, you make arguments. Now, until Charvaka, you can accommodate them. But these traditions were seen as so different that I don't think they saw it as something to write polemics against. But we still know that they inspired the Vijayanagaran kings. Ramadasa in Maharashtra inspired Shivaji to relentlessly fight the Mlecha. So it's not that they didn't recognize the other. I think they saw it as primarily a military issue. And I think for most part, the struggle against Islam was a military issue. Because as long as military victories could be gained, the Hindus could re-establish their traditions. Now, during the the fragments of the Bahmanid Sultanate, like the Nizam Shahi, the Deccan, you have Hindus who were trying to work with the sultans. They would write not polemics, but they would try to engage the sultan to let them practice their own ways. So once you are inside an Islamic kingdom, I don't think you had the opportunity of polemics. If you are writing something which was seriously offensive, you could lose your head. And if you are in a Hindu kingdom like Vijayanagara or the Hindavi Swarajya, you don't really need to write polemics anymore, because the objective was to sweep out Islam from India. That was Shivaji was quite clear about that. So I think this dynamic has to be kept in mind to explain why there was not that much polemical effort. And only in a case like Akbar's court in these post-jihadi years, where the Ghazi had now sort of become more apostate, you could have the space for such polemics. And this is seen elsewhere too, like Gemistos Platon, whom I mentioned earlier. He had a Jewish uh, associate known as Eliseus, who had become a heathen, and he had reinitiated the Iranian form of fire worship in his expedition. So the Osman Sultan caught him and immolated him. A fate very similar to our Brahmanas in Delhi, who converted these guys back to the Hindu faith. So I think there was a very real danger once you are in the Islamic under the Sharia. And once you are out of it, if you are in a Hindu Swarajya, the need for it was very limited.
I think this somewhat mirrors the present day situation where, people who live in Bangladesh or Pakistan, and the very few Hindus who actually live in Bangladesh or Pakistan do not have any opportunity to, engage in counter polemics because they're busy just keeping themselves alive, basically.
Absolutely. They lose the head if they wrote something.
Yeah. While if you're in Hindu majority India, you're already, on the back foot because you're being, accused of majoritarianism and you're accused of so many other things. So you really don't want to broach the topic of, polemics, counter polemics.
It's very dangerous in India. That is, I know this from my school and college days where I used to be very open, and people would, it was not the counter religions, it was our own, the Swapaksha, who would be saying, how are you saying such unsecular stuff?
Exactly. So it's the, if you look at it, you will say, we get along so well together. And the typical, as Kunrad put it elsewhere, the Hindu knows everything about everything, right? The Hindu will tell you why a man who has spent 14 years studying the Quran and the Hadith is wrong to blow himself up, and how he really didn't understand his religion correctly. And the Hindu will also say, will also teach how the Shankaracharya got Advaita completely wrong. So
yes. And I have seen this, like a guy trying to explain to me how Jinnah, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, misunderstood Islam. Now,
so that's, I mean, probably, I don't know whether it is a effect of, subversion, or in biological terms, whether it is the effect of an, civilizational infection or the effect of civilizational senescence.
The senescence part is a whole discussion in itself, which I think, given that we have gone on for a long time, I don't know if we want to break into that. But to use the biological analogy, the way I see it, which is quite apt to the current pandemic, is the inflammatory response.
Right.
So the immune system has a mechanism to detect invasive organisms. And once it detects it, it mounts an attack against it. Now, a part of this attack, because some bacteria and all viruses, they live inside cells of your own body. So the way you have to get rid of them is by killing your own cells. The infected cell has to die. So the body has certain cells which actually inject molecules, proteins, which cause the cell which has received that injection to commit suicide. So once it commits suicide, it brings down the virus or the bacterium which is living inside the cell and prevents the infection from spreading. So actually killing the infected cells is a very central line of defense across life. That's how all organisms deal with pathogens. Now, if this process goes out of control, then you'll start killing cells, even if they're not infected. So you have a runaway reaction which against your own cells, where you're causing them to commit suicide, even though they don't carry a virus or a bacterium inside them. So this kind of a response seems to happen even at the civilizational level. So you have the invader, you have the military response against the invader, like 1857 was the last great war we fought. It was a failure, but the failure, I think, was not so much the actual military defeat as much as the inflammatory response it left in its aftermath, where there was some loss of the self, non-self discrimination, or even the recognition of where and what the infection is. And that is continuing. So there is a reaction against the self. Everything Hindu is seen as negative. That was the cause of the defeat in 1857. That was the cause of our inferiority to the English, which resulted in us being ruled by them. It's a trauma which we still carry. And I don't think we have really come out of it. And secularism can be seen as one kind of offshoot of that. That is secularism used in the Indian sense.
Right, right. That's a very interesting take on the topic.